Here, and as I'm sure you know, I'm one of the pastors at North Park Church in Columbus, Nebraska, and I am here with your life group questions again for the week. I'm sure you probably already know that as well. And we're in our Kingdom series, week 188 of our Kingdom series, and we're studying straight through the Gospel of Matthew. We're at Matthew 24, verses 32 through 35 right now, and we're at part 5 of 7 Signs of the End mini series within that larger series. And remember, the previous 4 signs: first was the sign of confusion, second was the sign of persecution, third was the sign of the abomination of desolation, fourth last week was the sign of his coming, and this week we have excuse me, the sign of the fig tree. So I'm going to go ahead and read those verses that are right there on the screen in front of you. You guys have your copy of God's Word open, and of course something to write with, something to write on, your outline, and follow along as I read those verses, and we'll jump right into our discussion questions. So here we go. Matthew 24, 32 through 35. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he's near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So what we're seeing here, remember, excuse me, these things confirm the reality of Jesus' return. This is about Jesus keeping his promise, right? And remember that we talked about lessons surrounding the fig tree. And the first lesson was that creation confirms Jesus' return. And we talked a bit about that, talked about some verses from Romans 1, remember, that back all that up. And then the second lesson surrounding the fig tree was signs warn Jesus will return quickly. And then the third lesson from the fig tree that we talked about was that his word promises or guarantees Jesus' return. Okay, so bearing all of that in mind and prayerfully thinking back to the message on Sunday, let's go ahead and jump into our discussion questions. And the first one is this. Just the first one. Ignore number 5 down there. The first one is, what stood out to you most from this message and why? Pray about that and talk about that now. Okay, moving on to question 2. Hopefully that generated some good discussion, got you thinking there. Remember in the message, we were talking about creation, confirming Jesus' return, and the purpose of creation pointing to Christ, pointing to God. And we talked a bit, or learned a bit rather, about worldview and how that really affects everything. It affects our life in every aspect. So for question 2, what do these verses have to do with your worldview? And then think about this and talk about this. Does your worldview change in different circumstances? Now, ultimately, a worldview can't change. You have one worldview or another, but does your worldview appear to be different when you're outside of church than when you're inside of church? Pray about that and talk about that now. Okay. And clearly your worldview is either going to be, especially when it comes to creation confirming Jesus' return, that all things point to Christ and that all things are created through Christ, or it's going to be man-centered. It's going to be a humanist. It's going to be pursuing the things of man. So moving on to question 3, kind of bearing that in mind, dig a bit deeper to be personal here. For question 3, do you think that you have more hope in man's corrupt creations or in God's Word? Pray about that and talk about that now. And also be willing to talk about why you answered the way you did. Go ahead and do that now. Okay. And moving on to question 4 then. Dig even a bit deeper. Are you digging for man's promises or for God's? And what is one of God's promises that you frequently turn to? You know, this lesson is about Jesus keeping his promise, but it's vitally important that we're aware of what those promises are, right? Whether it's his return or that, for example, one of my go-tos is First Peter, excuse me, Second Peter, chapter 1, that God will give us everything that is necessary for a life of godliness. That's my go-to these days. What's one of yours? Something that God has on your mind, in your heart, to go to throughout your day these days. Pray about that and talk about that now. Okay, and then question 5, fifth and final question. You see it right there. Go ahead and someone in your group read 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, and just kind of have those in your mind and in your heart, in addition to our key verses. And then pray about and answer this. What is God revealing to you through this message? What's the big idea? And then how are you encouraged? Remember, we learn about this because believers should be encouraged when we study these lessons on the end times. So how are you encouraged? And what can you apply? What can you apply from what God is teaching you today? Well, that's it for this week, guys. Again, grateful to have been here with you. Quick reminder not to forget about the content that comes out throughout the week. Pastor Ryan's midweek message on Wednesdays, Jonathan Kaufman's youth lesson that comes out on Sunday mornings, and you can get that on the app, Inside NP app, or the website www.insidenp.com. And Lord willing, I will be back with you guys next week.